This is the Real Coaching Podcast. I'm Joel Filliol, an international triathlon coach based in the UK and Spain. And today we're going to talk about Zone 1 training. And this podcast is an extended version of the article that appeared on the Real Coaching Substack. If you'd like to support the podcast and further writing, you make sure you're signed up to the Real Coaching Substack. You can find the link in the show notes below. And equally, if you're interested in coaching, consulting, or supporting your own coaching practice, you can inquire on my website in the link below. And this article, titled Zone 1 Where the Magic Happens, had quite a big response. It was a bit surprising in a way. And this subheading really was slow down to go faster and farther. And it was surprising to me because so much of what we see online, popular media, sort of the fitness training influencer space, is about high intensity interval training, about high end work, VO2 max, about LT2, etc. And my thesis really is it misses the point of where performance comes from in the long term, and actually the basic, unsexy, consistent work over time is really where performance and talent reaches its ultimate level. And so the too long didn't read, or the summary for this article really was much like the theme of the last episodes, where we talked about championship performance reflections, about not being a January champion, and about progression in training. Each of these connects to what we're going to talk about today, which is the most common error that I see in training is doing our low intensity work too fast. Well, the second most common is the high intensity work too fast, but the probably a bigger error in the long term is doing the low intensity work too fast. And the more recent focus on zone 2 training as a thing, and you see this, it's fascinating to see again outside of the endurance space, in the wider sort of fitness and health space, people talking about zone 2. So it's really spread far and wide, but my theory is that is contribute to athletes going too fast on their low intensity training, because we're quantifying it. Even if you have ranges of intensity, everyone wants to be at the top end of that range, and that in the long term contributes to problems that we'll discuss today. And the next part of this was the theory that intensity management is what allows us for that consistent accumulation of volume and chronic load over time. So we manage the volume of intensity so we can get the total volume accumulated. And that's actually that long-term chronic load, volume, and accumulation is the driver of success in endurance sport. And it doesn't necessarily mean, the athlete that accumulates the most wins. There's an individual context there, but that's the underpinning philosophy that drives endurance success. So going into where did this come from? Where did this idea about zone 2 come from? And I suppose Tadej Pogacar's previous coach, Inigo San Milan, was on a few high-profile podcasts and videos where he was discussing this, and he's obviously a very clued in guy, very smart guy, and really the big interest in metabolic health, which I think is part of what sort of drives this idea about endurance training for also the general population. And I suppose it's worth clarifying now that when we're talking about zone two, we're thinking about really in sort of a 5 or 6 zone model. So zone two sort of corresponds with the upper end of LT1. So it's below or up to the top of where LT1 would occur. And zone one is of course easier than that, but might contrast. This 3 zone model is quite popular in the literature at the moment, which sort of combines zone one and two in sort of a green zone. Um, that they would call zone one, and then zone two is between LT1 and LT2, and then zone three in that model is above LT2. And I find for my own training prescription that there's not enough differentiation in there, and that is in a 3 zone model. So actually, what we do in our international squad JFT crew is actually quite different in the sense that we use RPE descriptors. And in the Substack, you can go and look at the translation table that I've put together, and a further post in the future and podcast will go into a little more detail into why I use those models. But I think connecting RPE, so rating of perceived exertion sensations, how athletes actually feel in training, I think is a very powerful way to prescribe and execute training. So we actually use the descriptors easy. It's obvious, but this is zone one, recovery and low intensity. Cruise is zone two in the context that we're discussing it today. Steady would be a typical zone three in the 5 or 6 zone model. So sub LT2, between LT2 and between LT1 and LT2. Solid would be threshold or above LT2, and then maybe a hard effort is even above that. So well beyond LT2, like VO2 max. And then we would also sort of have a fast descriptor for strides or sprints, depending on the context. But so this all came from I believe from the popularization and from the rise of Pogacar's success when he first won the Tour. Inigo San Milan was talking about his training, and there's great interest in, well, how did he perform at these kind of levels? And there was a lot of discussion about the amount of zone 2 training being highlighted as a cornerstone of his program. But interestingly, then he moved to a new coach, Javier Sola, a Spanish coach, and he seems to have completely transformed his cycling performance. And Solo's talked about some changes to his program, more stuff in the gym was one part, and a different intensity focuses in his training, including all different focus. So I'm sure he's still doing some zone 2 training, but certainly the dialogue has changed and his performance changed. And does it mean anything on whether the utility of zone 2 is the same? Is the change, but would he have performed even better had he changed his training sooner? Well, I mean, we just don't know. And I suppose, again, it's another reason why it's difficult to use and maybe not wise to over attribute a particular training methodology to one athlete's success based on what they say they're doing without fully understanding what they're doing. We don't know if individual athletes are are they successful because of what they're doing, or even is what's talked about in public, is that reality? We just don't have the full context. So it's very interesting how it's changed, and there's plenty of good evidence around the metabolic fitness, mitochondrial health, for endurance training in the general population. In the Substack, I've linked to an article by author Alex Hutchinson, who's gone sort of deep into where all this came from, and what it means for endurance sport. And in that article, he asks, is it possible to go too easy? And I think it's an interesting question. When I think of the mistakes that I've made in training and coaching, and I've made all of them. Going too easy, well, it's hard to quantify what too easy may be. How do you know if you went too easy? But when I think of the mistakes I've made, or when things have gone wrong, it's mostly on the other end. It's one rep too many, too hard, too fast, um, and then something breaks. Typically an injury, stress response, stress fracture, tendon issue. However, it doesn't always mean that it was that session. Okay, that session was the straw that broke the camel's back, but what was the context before that? And going too hard all the time, too much time spent in the upper ends of the low intensities could also contribute to the context where we see things that eventually break down. So, of course, yeah, depending on the context, there is such a thing as intensity that is too low to be useful. For some athletes, the watts are too low. If the speeds are too low, you can ask, are you better off sitting on the sofa than than outside? And for the most part, I'd say no. There's still metabolic reasons why you want to keep moving, why you want to accumulate volume. Um, and really for most athletes, accumulating volume over time is going to be a key driver, and any amount of any intensity is better than no intensity. So again, the position is really that going too fast for easy low intensity is the main problem that we see. We see this in warm-ups, even athletes going too fast in the warm-up relative to their levels. Trying to make every ride a zone 2 ride, as opposed to, and maybe upper end of zone 2, as opposed to doing a certain amount of training actually in zone 1, and even being flexible to vary the lower intensity training according to recovery levels. So if we're going slightly too easy, again, come back to this question: is it possible to go too easy? Well, if we do enough volume for the easy training, we're still going to accumulate chronic load over time. That's going to improve our potential for long-term development, and I think it's also a kind of safety measure in that, in order to be consistent, we need to manage and moderate intensity, including the low intensities. So when we're talking about intensity management, it's often the focus on the high level, what interval intensity we're doing, what are watts at LD2, etc. But equally, the range is in the low side. We also need to manage that. And if we train too high of an intensity for endurance training, it can, again, set the context where we can find ourselves, in a session having done one rep too many. We end up with issues that can result in injury, and again, it's not just that one session, it's the context before. If an athlete is on the limit before, then that it might be that one track session or hard run, you might see that, okay, that's the one afterwards they have pain. But if we back up the context before that, what was the load, what was the recovery? So looking at, when I look at training analysis for either new athletes or in a consulting context, this is what I often see, that the intensities prescribed in the training plan are too high. And either based on the goal model of training, which is like, I want to run 15 minutes for 5K, then all my efforts need to be at 3 minutes a K. So that's, an example of we're training to a target. Or the other thing that happens is, interpretation of current fitness is not reality. So this is often at the beginning of the year as well. Like, we need to adjust our paces and zones down because the fitness is down from the end of the previous season. And or we just have a disconnection of reality in general, where athletes are training at intensities and ranges that are beyond what they've demonstrated in performances. And you'd think with the amount of lab testing that many athletes are doing that this wouldn't be as common as it is. But again, thanks to Strava and otherwise what athletes post on social media, you can see all the time athletes that are doing efforts that far exceed what they've demonstrated in reality. And it's a very common trap to fall into. And I like the concept that you need to earn the right to train at higher intensities through objective performances. I think that's the most effective way to structure training intensities by what you've demonstrated, and we don't always find that from the lab settings, but even then, is the most common error I'm seeing. So the second part, so that's the high intensity being too fast. And then the second part is this low intensity too fast. So in the article, and I have to think about this, like the speed skill to go slow. It's a skill to slow down. And I see athletes who seem to be like uncomfortable running slowly enough, and or their ego doesn't let them do it. And I've seen this proliferate due to measuring everything all the time. Everyone runs with a GPS watch all the time. Back in the day when we weren't doing that necessarily, you wouldn't have that pace in your face that is encouraging you to go a little too fast. So there's the ego part, and there's the skill. I mean, it's not a skill per se, like a technical skill, but just the understanding of why and how we need to slow down. So, and I often talk about running here because it's the sport where there's the most possibility of error that's going to lead to significant problems. Then the other part I often see is the inability to distinguish between zone one, easy, and zone two, more of an endurance pace. But zone two, again, it's the top end of zone two is not really easy. So that's again something that we see. The desire to always be at the upper end of zone two, and that's going to result. If that's done all the time or too frequently, it's going to result in sort of an unintentional fatigue creeping in that eventually is going to mount, and it's going to require a change in training to catch up on recovery. So I think this more recently, this awareness and attention on zone two has resulted in many athletes going too fast for their low intensity training. And I think in particular, it sort of affects you might say that the chronically online endurance athlete who's reading everything that's going on, is paying attention to what everyone is doing, and maybe is a little too focused on the short term, needs to zoom out. So what happens if you're doing too much of this low intensity too fast? Again, it's about what happens to the long-term stability of training loads. And we see a resulting instability, that training becomes less sustainable, consistency drops because we end up needing to take more recovery than we planned. So we're I think the low intensity, too much low intensity creeps up on us, too much higher intensity in the low intensity. So when we're doing our zone one or zone two too fast, that's when we see this, that it creeps up, then we need to change the training as a result. So if and I see this, some athletes, they believe they need to do all their endurance training at zone two, and they resist doing zone one training because I think it's either too easy or inefficient to be useful. But again, it can be unsustainable then if we're not able to go easy when we need to, and when the body is telling us that we need to go easy. So, so ensuring that our easy training is actually in zone one allows for better recovery, adaptation, fewer interruptions over the long term, and ultimately greater consistency and greater accumulation of chronic training load. So in particular with running, you might say that some people that are new to running and or not terribly fit may not even have a zone one for running, meaning that they're just not actually fit enough to run. And essentially, zone one for them would be walking or hiking. However, that's also fine. So maybe not the population that's listening to this or reading, but the point is that we need to slow down enough in order to think about the big picture and long term. So in the article, I linked to a research paper that says much ado about zone two. It was in 2025, and probably at the end of the zone two hype. Although you might say in some spaces that's still continuing, but there's a quote said the current evidence does not support zone 2 training as the optimal training intensity for improving mitochondrial or fatty acid oxidative capacity. Further evidence suggests prioritizing higher exercise intensities above zone 2 is critical to maximize cardiometabolic health benefits, particularly in the context of lower training volumes. So again, you're thinking like, what is the population might be reading this or listening? Where is the advice tailored, or who is it for? Because just reading this. So in the general population, who don't exercise enough, who don't do enough of any zones, of course, anything is better than nothing, and slightly higher intensities will have a greater stimulus, of course, in the context of lower training volumes. But I found this interesting because, of course, higher intensities have greater stimulus for adaptation in the short term. We know that. And it's a bit of the problem with. I suppose the academic approach to looking at training and physiology is inevitably it's very short-term focused. But of course, again, the theory here is that the accumulation of low intensity is actually the bigger driver of metabolic health and performance. And it was interesting, after this article was published, last week at this time, Alistair Brownlee had an Instagram post and social posts about basically saying that those who trained more hours, more minutes, performed better, and that would be, we also see big data sets like Strava that are able to correlate the amount of training that's recorded with performance, and in other spaces as well, we see this accumulation of volume as the biggest driver of performance, more or less, as we said at the beginning. if you're able to train more volume, you'll probably perform better. All things being equal, there's always it depends there, but in general, that's what we're trying to do. And and particularly for metabolic health, it's a whole other topic that I think is interesting to think about in the context of the fueling discussion of late, and the trends of fueling. Metabolic health and metabolic flexibility are interesting topics to go into. But in general, though, again, I think a lot of our discussion around training sort of misses the point in that, of course, we want to manage intensity in order to do more volume. But we've got to get the right way around. We're trying to accumulate volume, therefore we need to manage intensity, I think is the right way to think about it. So again, we saw, in the last number of years, the popularization of the polarized training model. I think it resonates with many in the performance space, due to this home truth that we know that most, in particular, elite athletes. It came from studies and observations of elite athletes, that most of their training volume is easy, is low intensities. And of course, we're discussing today the differentiation between those low intensities, but the purpose is, in order to do enough volume, you've got to manage your intensities both at the high end and the low end, and getting that balance between this long-term progressive increase in chronic training load and the right dose of intensity then when we're talking about preparing for specific goal events. And again, that's coming back to that Championship Reflections article, where again, we look at the most common errors that we're doing in preparing for championships, and getting too high of a dose of intensity too frequently through the season, again, is a common error. But this balance between long term and short term is always something that we're interested in coaching and performance. And I suppose it's the art of coaching, the art of performance. There's a science underpinning it, but I think it's taking that sort of meta view of performance, where we're thinking big picture. We're not just thinking short term, what's going to have the biggest impact, because of course studies will show that higher intensity has a very big stimulus and impact, but let's think about the long term, and how we can be consistent and progressing in the long term to achieve our potential. So yeah, when we decrease the volume of high intensity, we can do more volume of low intensity over time. It becomes more manageable to do more intensity and more volume over time. Sorry. And similarly, when slowing down also the low intensity work allows athletes to accumulate more work over time. So we make the easy enough so that we can do enough over the long term and progress. And on the polarized model, I mean, that it's often described as 80% of the sessions being easy, 20% hard. Even that, for new athletes, are better off with a different ratio. Even even fewer sessions at high intensity and more at low intensity is perhaps more sustainable to accumulate more frequency and volume safely. And another example that's connected to this, bringing it to life, and I'm not one to use my own training too much, because I'm not training for anything in particular. And not that there's anything wrong with using one's own training, particularly from a coaching space. It's just not been the lens that I've used to understand training and preparation. As I said, I'm not a high-level athlete, and I'm not trying to compete. And since really, I guess COVID times, really, when the work process changed so much for most of us, that I made some changes to look after a bit more of my physical and mental health, and so started running and getting fit more than, certainly part of the problem with coaching is you spend so much time looking after everyone else that it's very easy to not prioritize yourself. So I started running more again, and over the last few years, I've accumulated more running than really the majority of athletes I coach. And I think actually probably over more than any of the athletes that I coach. And of course, frequency is a very powerful way to do that, because I run pretty much every day. Um, and of course, it's an n equals one, and I'm not trying to be competitive, but just from the fear many have about running frequency and running volume, uh, my thesis is if you slow down enough, even in a high mechanical load discipline like running, you can run a lot. And so, yeah, the last 4 years in the article, I've got a chart of pulled from Strava. My frequency is more than one per day. So typically, 420 runs a year on average. And of course, that's due to doing a number of doubles. And somewhere in the range of 400 to 450 hours of running per year. And again, mostly zone one, and just running by feel and running easy. So a small example of the power of slowing things down and being able to accumulate more. So again, the kind of getting to the summary of that high load with high intensity is often where we see most injuries coming from in running, but also coming back to too much volume of intensity, and actually the level of intensity itself, speeds too fast, is one error. And then the other one that we're summarizing here is that the speeds of the low intensity work kind of equally be too fast and too stressful for the long term, and therefore slowing the pace and speeds of the low intensity work can be a positive thing to try to implement in training, and disconnecting ego from pace, and thinking big picture. And I think I suppose it's the job of coaching to see the big picture of what can be lost in the short term with athletes that are motivated to improve and wanting to get better, and then therefore trying to push a little bit too fast all the time, including the easy work. And I had an interesting note from a former athlete who read this article, and I think anybody that has been in the competitive space or that has had high goals can fall into this trap of chasing fitness, chasing confidence, and it leads to just the whole range of intensity being too high. And this athlete had commented that learning to slow down had been a positive impact on overall stress, as well as sort of that physical training stress. And it's something that is a thread that, again, thinking for long-term big picture performance, of using exercise and physical fitness to manage also physical stress. And low intensity work, I think, can help that underpinning management of stress that that sort of high intensity just contributes to more of. But again, we're thinking, what's stopping most of us from achieving our potential? I think it's the sustainability of our approach. It's what's stopping us from absorbing and recovering from the work that we want to do. Is that overall holistic stress, and both from in and certainly from outside of training, that's affecting our ability to absorb the work that we do. and therefore the power of slowing down, the power of creating more space and thinking big picture. Again, it's a performance advantage for those that are able to manage their ego, to manage short-term versus long-term. So the conclusion, slowing down will help you go faster in the long run. And again, this seems to have resonated with a lot of people, some interesting comments and questions. And it's something that can be implemented in training, thinking about, let's look at the intensities that we're doing, that we're trying to achieve for the long term. And sometimes slower is faster. So to support the podcast and the Substack, go make sure you're signed up to the Real Coaching Substack. Link is below. Make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. You can also watch the video version if you're not already on YouTube, though audio is the most popular. And if interested in exploring deeper into your own training, whether you're doing too much of your work at too high of an intensity, consulting is available, or coaching, and coaches wanting a second set of eyes on their training and coaching can also get in contact through the website. So thanks for listening.